Hi, students. In the videos this week, we're talking about content that comes from Chapter 3. And right now, we're looking at three different claims that are made when we see research that is cited. And it can be cited either in the popular press or it could be cited in an empirical study in a journal article. So, we're going to talk about differences between frequency claims, association claims, and causal claims. So, let's get going. We're going to first talk about frequency claims. Now, when we're reading about an article and it makes a frequency claim, it's going to be describing a particular level or a degree of a single variable. So with frequency claims, we're only seeing a single variable that has been identified. And that variable is going to be a measured variable. It's not something that can be manipulated. It is just measured. They've gone out and collected data on it. So here's an example. In a recent study of couples, more than a third of them met online. Here's another one. Only 36% of Americans can locate North Korea on a map. Or 60% of college students admit to some form of cheating. Now, for each of these claims, there's just a single variable. So in the first claim, in a recent study, the only variable we have here is couples. And we're looking at what percent or what amount met online. There's just one variable that's been measured. In the second claim, we're looking at what percentage of Americans can locate North Korea on a map. There's just one variable, how many Americans. And in the last variable, again, we just have a single variable that's measured. What percentage of college students admit to some form of cheating? So with a frequency claim, there's just a single variable, and that variable has been measured. We've collected data on it. The second type of a claim is an association claim. Now, this is going to be different from a frequency claim because with association claims, we've got the level of one variable being associated with the level of another variable. So as you can see here, there are at least two variables, and both of these variables are measured. So in that sense, data has been collected on these variables. Now, often these association claims are called also correlational claims. We see that the two variables correlate. They relate to each other. They go together. So for example, coffee consumption is associated with lower levels of depression. Now we have two variables there and they have been measured. They haven't been manipulated, they've just been measured. So we have measured coffee consumption, how many cups of coffee consumed in a day, and we've also measured levels of depression. Here's another one. Exercise is linked to higher pay. Now, linked is another word for associated or correlated. So here, one variable is exercise. We've collected data on that. Another variable is pay, and we've collected data on that. And we have some way to assess what means higher or lower pay. The last claim we have here I think is super interesting. Extroverts tend to like upbeat, danceable, contemporary music. We have a tendency here, but again, this is an association claim. We have two variables. We have a personality variable, and somebody's collected data on whether individuals fall into the category of being extroverted or introverted. What are they like on that variable? And then also we've got data collected on or measured on type of music that somebody likes. Do they like upbeat, danceable, contemporary music, or do they like some other kind of a variable? So some other kind of music, sorry. So we have two variables and they have been measured. Now with association claims, the advantage is that they allow us to predict future behavior. So what I mean by that, if we know that there is an association between coffee consumption and depression levels, if we know about somebody's coffee consumption, we can make a prediction about their depression levels. And vice versa. If we know what their depression levels are, we may be able to make a prediction about their coffee consumption. Now, the important point here is because these are just association claims and they have to do with two variables being measured, We can never say that correlation is equal to causation. So, using that example we mentioned a minute ago, coffee consumption being associated with lower levels of depression, if we know something about somebody's coffee consumption, we can make a prediction about their depression level, but we can never say that coffee consumption had an impact on depression level. Or vice versa. We can never say depression level had an impact or caused something with coffee consumption because all we've done with these association claims is measure two variables. We haven't manipulated anything. So let's talk a little bit more about these association claims. And you've probably heard some of this content in your other classes. There are three kinds of association claims we can briefly describe. The first has to do with positive associations, or also referred to as positive correlations. Now, with positive correlations, the two variables move in the same direction. And what I mean by that is if you have a high score on one variable, you tend to also have a high score on the other variable. Or if you have a low score on one of the variables, you tend to have a low score on the other variable. So the two variables move in the same direction. The scores are both high or the scores are both low. Now, the example that is posted here, and it also appears in the book, is that there is this positive correlation or positive association between exercise and income. So as somebody exercises more, we have higher exercise ratings. We also have higher income ratings. Where we have lower exercise, we also have lower income ratings. So the scores tend to cluster in the low and the low, and in the high and the high. And as you can see, there's a lot of variability in between. But essentially, the scores um, tend to show a positive correlation here. They tend to be increasing from low to high on both of the variables. Now, there's all kinds of other examples of positive correlations, positive associations. I want to throw a few of them out to you. Typically in classes, we find a positive correlation between time spent studying and exam scores, right? So students who spend more time studying tend to have higher exam scores. Students who spend less time studying tend to also have lower exam scores. We would also predict that class attendance is associated with grades. So I would predict that students who attend class more have higher class attendance tend to have higher grades in the class. Now, again, because this is an association claim and I've just measured two variables, I haven't manipulated anything, we can never say correlation is causation. We can't say that coming to class caused you to have a higher grade in psychology 1, because it could be due to multiple other factors. But we can say that one thing predicts another. So positive associations are one type of an association. You've also read about negative associations. Now, I want to make sure that you understand with negative, we're talking about this term mathematically. We're not thinking about negative as being bad and positive being good. With a negative association, it just means that there's a negative correlation or that the two variables move in opposite or inverse directions. So, what I mean by that is that high scores tend to be associated with low scores on the other variable, or low scores on one variable tends to be associated with high scores on another variable. Now here we have, again, an example that's posted in the book, and I want to mention it. And this example has to do with coffee consumption and depression scores, specifically for women. So the research that's cited indicates that there is a negative relationship or negative association between coffee consumption and depression scores. So as coffee goes up, if we see along the x-axis here, people that tend to drink more coffee tend to have lower levels of depression. Now, conversely, people that drink less coffee tend to have higher levels of depression. So as you can see, the pattern is different than the pattern we looked at in the last slide, right? So high levels of coffee is associated with low levels of depression, and low levels of coffee are associated with higher levels of depression. Now, again, this is just a negative correlation. It doesn't mean good or bad. Another example, is that there tends to be a negative association or negative correlation between exercise and depression. So, individuals who engage in higher levels of exercise tend to have lower levels of depression. And the opposite is also true. Individuals that tend to have higher levels of depression also tend to have lower levels of exercise. Here's one more. Time spent on TikTok tends to be negatively correlated with time spent studying. So, as TikTok time goes up, studying time probably goes down. And if TikTok time is low, time spent studying tends to be high. Now, again, because we're talking about correlations, we can never say correlation is equal to causation. So, even if we have a strong negative correlation, we can't say one caused the other. Now, our last example of an association is what's sometimes referred to as a zero association or no correlation. And that just means that the two variables are not associated with each other. Now, the book used this example, and there is research to support it that time of dinner is not associated with childhood weight. Now, we have the figure over here, and it may look like a positive relationship, but it also may look like a negative relationship because really the scatter plot, which shows the dots that map up with when dinner is eaten earlier versus later, and if the child tends to be associated with less obese or more obese, the dots are all over the place. There really doesn't look like any discernible pattern. So we would say that there's a zero correlation here or no association between these two variables. They're not correlated with each other. Now, other things we could probably predict have no correlation either. So there is probably no association between shoe size and exam scores. Higher or lower shoe size, higher or lower exam scores, they don't tend to be related. There's nothing about shoe size that should predict exam scores. Also, hair color and musical ability. There's probably nothing about somebody's hair color that is in any way associated with high or low scores on musical ability. Again, no correlation. And since there's no correlation, we really can't make a prediction here. All right, now we've talked about frequency claims, we've talked about association claims. We're going to finish with causal claims. These are the strongest claims that can be made by researchers, and psychologists really tend to be interested in causal claims. We're going to focus on these kinds of claims in our class. So, in a causal claim, we're talking about one variable causing a change, causes changes in the levels of another variable. Now, again, we've got two variables. We had two variables when we talked about association claims. With causal claims, we have at least two variables. We may even have more. Um, Now, the only time we can make a causal claim or a causal claim should be made is if the researcher has conducted an experiment. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time in the next couple of classes talking about what is an experiment and what makes something an experiment versus just a correlational study. But we're going to introduce it here. So, experiments, they have to have one manipulated variable and they have to have one or more measured variables. Now, we've talked about manipulated and measured variables in class, or we'll be talking about them in class. They're also presented in chapter 3 as well. But as you can see, frequency claims just talk about one measured variable. Association claims just talk about one measured variable. Causal claims talk about one manipulated variable and one measured variable. Now, some examples of this that are presented in class and in the book have to do with pretending to be Batman helps kids stay on task. So now if you remember, if you've read through this study that's described in the book, pretending to be Batman was something that was manipulated. It was a variable manipulated by the researcher. And then they measured how well the child was able to stay on task. So appearing to be more intimidating, if you want to appear to be more intimidating, you need to tilt your head down. So we have two variables here. We have appearance of intimidating and we have what you do with your head. Now, tilting of the head was the manipulated variable and the measured variable was appearing more intimidating. I'm going to give us one more and we're going to briefly talk about this one before we end. So, interestingly, using a fidget spinner can impair memory for a video lecture. All right, now we have two variables in this statement. We have the fidget spinner and we have memory. And the variable that's been manipulated is the fidget spinner use, and memory is the measured variable. Now let's explore this last claim just a little bit more. Now, this comes from an article, and I've posted it to Canvas, Soars and Storm. They did a research article, and they called it Putting a Negative Spin on It. Using a fidget spinner can impair memory for a video lecture. So you have the summary in your notes, and like I said, the whole article should be posted to Canvas. But as we read through this, if we're trying to figure out what is the measured variable and what is the manipulated variable, we can see that college age students watched educational videos while either using a fidget spinner or not. That was the manipulated variable. And then they found that using a fidget spinner was associated with increased reports of attentional lapses, diminished judgments of learning, and impaired performance on a memory test. So they actually have several measured variables here. There was only one in the title, but they have several measured variables. So this would be a study that allows us to make a causal claim, or it's appropriate for them to use a causal claim. All right, now we're going to take a break here. We're going to come back, check your comprehension, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how the claims map to different kinds of validity. All right, see you next time.